The murder everyone agreed to ignore, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a death the village chose not to talk about, quiet, sudden, and inconvenient. In St. Mary Mead, gossip flows freely, but sometimes certain events are swept under the rug, dismissed as accidents, or explained away with polite excuses. This was one of those events. Miss Marple notices what everyone else pretends not to see, the whispers that stop when she enters a room, the uneasy glances, and the subtle signs that this tragedy was far from natural. While the villagers insist it's better left alone, she knows that ignoring a crime does not erase it, it only hides the truth for a little while. As she gently untangles the threads of deceit, it becomes clear that someone expected the village to remain silent, but Miss Marple never ignores what others choose to forget. Before we uncover the truth behind the murder everyone wanted to ignore, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Murder Everyone Agreed to Ignore. The village of Elderwick was the kind of place that seemed untouched by the darker parts of the world, a place where everything appeared settled, predictable, and quietly respectable. Its narrow lanes curved gently between rows of well-kept cottages, each with trimmed hedges and polished windows that reflected a life of order and routine. People spoke in measured tones, greeted one another with polite familiarity, and carried on with their days as though nothing could ever disturb the calm rhythm of village life. It was, by all appearances, a place where nothing truly terrible could happen. Yet Miss Marple had lived long enough to understand that such places often hid the deepest secrets, for where everything seemed perfect, people worked the hardest to keep certain truths from ever being seen. She arrived on a grey morning, when the sky hung low over the village and the air carried a stillness that felt unnatural. It was not simply the quiet of the countryside, but something heavier, something watchful, as though the village itself had paused and was holding its breath. Her journey had been uneventful, yet the moment she stepped into Elderwick, she sensed it immediately. Something had happened here, something that had unsettled the natural order, and yet no one seemed willing to acknowledge it openly. That, more than anything, told her that whatever had occurred was not simple. Her visit had been arranged by Mrs. Harriet Collins, an old acquaintance whose letters were usually filled with light observations and gentle humor. This time, however, the letter had been different. It had been polite, carefully worded, but beneath its surface ran a current of unease that Miss Marple could not ignore. Harriet had not written plainly of the matter, but she had hinted just enough to make it clear that something was wrong, and more importantly, that no one in the village was willing to say so aloud. Harriet greeted her warmly at the small but well-kept house on the edge of the village, though the warmth felt practiced rather than natural. Her smile appeared quickly, but it faded just as quickly, and her eyes betrayed a tension she could not conceal. She ushered Miss Marple inside with polite urgency, speaking of tea and comfort, as though those ordinary rituals could shield them from the subject she was clearly avoiding. Once they were seated, Harriet poured tea with careful precision, but her hands trembled ever so slightly, and the faint clink of porcelain against porcelain sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. For a time, she spoke of ordinary matters, of the weather, of the small changes in the village, but her voice lacked ease, and her thoughts seemed elsewhere. Miss Marple listened patiently, offering gentle responses, allowing the silence to grow where it wished. She knew that people often revealed what troubled them most not when pressed, but when given space to speak. At last, Harriet set down the teapot with a soft but decisive movement, as though she had reached the point where she could delay no longer. "There has been a death," she said, her voice lowered, careful and uncertain. "At the Hawthorne house. Mr. Edwin Hawthorne was found dead." The name carried weight. Even without knowing the man personally, Miss Marple understood at once that this was no ordinary villager. There was a significance to the way Harriet spoke the name, a recognition of influence and importance. A man like Edwin Hawthorne would not pass unnoticed, and yet something in Harriet's tone suggested that his death had not been treated in the way one might expect. "And how did he die?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm and steady. "They say it was an accident," Harriet replied. "A fall in his study. He was found at the bottom of the staircase. The doctor declared it a tragic misstep, and that was the end of it." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened. "They say," she repeated gently. "And what do you believe?" Harriet hesitated, her composure faltering as she leaned forward slightly. "I believe it was not an accident," she said quietly. "And what is worse, no one seems willing to question it. It was decided so quickly, accepted so easily, as though everyone had already agreed before the words were even spoken." Miss Marple considered this in silence. Villagers did not behave that way. They were curious by nature, inclined to speculate, to question, to discuss even the smallest irregularity at length. A sudden and complete agreement, especially in the face of death, was not natural. It suggested something far more deliberate. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked through Elderwick, her pace unhurried, her eyes quietly observant. She noticed how conversation softened as she passed, how people greeted her politely but avoided holding her gaze for too long. There was a shared understanding among them, something unspoken but clearly present, a sense that certain topics were not to be discussed. It was not fear in the obvious sense, but rather a controlled silence, a decision made and maintained. The Hawthorne house stood apart from the others, larger and more imposing, its presence commanding yet strangely withdrawn. Its windows appeared dark despite the daylight, and its door remained firmly closed, as though the house itself had chosen to keep the outside world at a distance. There was a stillness about it that felt unnatural, not the quiet of an empty house, but the quiet of something concealed. Miss Marple approached without hesitation. The gate opened easily, and the path showed little sign of recent use, as though visitors had come and gone quickly, leaving no trace behind. When the door was answered, the maid who greeted her seemed momentarily unsettled, though she quickly composed herself and allowed Miss Marple inside after a brief introduction. The interior of the house was as orderly as one might expect, yet there was a noticeable absence of warmth. The air felt still, almost heavy, as though the rooms had been carefully arranged to hide any sign of disruption. Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne received her in the drawing-room, dressed in black, her posture perfect, her expression controlled to a degree that suggested more than simple composure. There was no visible grief, no sign of the emotional disarray that often followed sudden loss. Instead, there was precision, as though every word and gesture had been carefully chosen in advance. "My husband's death was a terrible misfortune," she said, her voice even and composed. "But accidents do happen." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her gaze thoughtful. "Yes, they do," she replied. "Though sometimes they are not quite as simple as they appear." For a brief moment, something shifted in Eleanor's expression, a flicker of something sharper beneath the calm. "There is nothing unusual about what happened," she said, her tone firm but controlled. "I would prefer that it not be made into something it is not." Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she allowed a small pause before making a simple request. "I wonder if I might see the study." The hesitation that followed was slight but noticeable. Refusing would have drawn attention, yet granting the request was clearly unwelcome. At last, Eleanor rose and led the way without another word. The study was a room of order and structure, lined with books and dominated by a large desk placed with careful precision. At the far end, a staircase led to a narrow gallery above. It was there, Miss Marple knew, that Edwin Hawthorne was said to have fallen. She moved slowly, taking in every detail, noting the arrangement of furniture, the absence of disturbance, the complete lack of anything that might suggest a struggle or sudden movement. It was too orderly. Accidents rarely left a room untouched. They disrupted, displaced, and left behind small but telling signs of their violence. This room, however, remained perfectly composed, as though nothing at all had happened within it. Her gaze moved to the staircase. The railing was firm, well maintained, and showed no sign of damage or weakness. It did not suggest a place where one might easily slip. Instead, it suggested stability, intention, and control. The more she observed, the clearer it became that the explanation of a simple fall did not fit the evidence before her. When she left the house, the conclusion had already formed in her mind. Edwin Hawthorne had not died by accident. His death had been caused by someone, and the evidence had been carefully arranged to suggest otherwise. Yet what troubled her more was not the act itself, but the response that followed it. The following morning, she visited Dr. Leonard Price, whose calm and professional manner seemed designed to reassure. He spoke with confidence, repeating the same conclusion without hesitation. It was an accident, he said, nothing more. When Miss Marple asked if there had been any irregularities, any detail that might suggest otherwise, there was the slightest pause before he answered. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. It told her that the certainty he presented was not entirely genuine. By the time she returned to Harriet's house, the pattern was unmistakable. Every person she had encountered held the same view, spoke the same explanation, and avoided the same questions. It was not coincidence. It was agreement. And agreement of that kind, especially in a village, did not happen without reason. That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall against the windows, Harriet looked at her with quiet urgency. She did not need to ask directly. The answer was already there, waiting to be spoken. "You see it, don't you?" she said. Miss Marple folded her hands gently, her expression calm but certain. "Yes," she replied. Harriet leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then you understand why I asked you to come." "I do," Miss Marple said softly. "Because this is not simply a question of how a man died." The rain grew steadier, filling the silence with its quiet rhythm. "This," she continued, her voice calm and deliberate, "is a case where the truth is known, and yet deliberately ignored." Harriet's breath caught. "But why would anyone do that?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the darkened window, where the reflection of the room seemed to fade into the night beyond. "Because," she said quietly, "whatever truly happened in that house is something the entire village has chosen not to face." Outside, the rain fell over Elderwick, steady and unrelenting, as though trying to wash away something that refused to be forgotten. And within that silence, the truth remained hidden, not because it could not be seen, but because no one had dared to look at it directly. Chapter 2: The Truth They All Chose to Hide. The following evening, the Hawthorne house no longer felt silent. It felt tense, as though the walls themselves were aware that something long buried was about to be brought into the light. One by one, they arrived, each carrying the same quiet unease. Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne stood near the fireplace, composed as ever, though her stillness now felt strained. Dr. Leonard Price kept to one side, his expression controlled but distant. The servants stood together, closer than necessary, as though strength could be found in numbers. Even Harriet Collins remained near the door, uncertain, watching. Miss Marple stood at the center of the room, calm and unhurried, her presence alone enough to hold their attention. No one spoke at first. They did not need to. They all knew why they had been called there. "It is a remarkable thing," Miss Marple began gently, how a village can agree so completely on something that is not true. The word settled into the room, drawing every gaze toward her. You have all said the same thing, she continued. That Edwin Hawthorne died by accident. That he fell. That there was nothing more to consider. She paused slightly, letting the weight of their own words return to them. But what is far more interesting is how quickly you all agreed. Eleanor's voice came, steady but sharp. There is nothing to agree upon. It was an accident. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. No, she said softly. It was not. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Miss Marple took a slow step forward. Mr. Hawthorne did not fall, she said. He was pushed. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the room. No one spoke, but the truth had already begun to shift the air between them. But that, Miss Marple continued, is only part of the story. The more important question is, how it happened, and why no one chose to stop it. Her gaze moved across them, resting on each face just long enough to make them feel seen. On that evening, she said, Mr. Hawthorne was not alone in the study. He had called several of you there, one after another. Not by accident, but by design. Dr. Price looked up slightly, his composure tightening. He was a man who liked control, Miss Marple went on. A man who held influence over others. And he used that influence well. Financial pressure. Personal secrets. Quiet threats. Each of you, in your own way, had something to lose because of him. The room grew still. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the servants. You knew how he treated people. You heard things. You saw things. You understood more than you ever said. The younger maid lowered her gaze. Then Miss Marple looked toward Dr. Price. And you, she said calmly, knew what he was capable of. You had seen the consequences of his decisions. Dr. Price said nothing. Finally, her gaze settled on Eleanor Hawthorne. And you, Miss Marple said quietly, had lived with it longer than anyone. Eleanor did not move. On that evening, Miss Marple continued, he called you into the study. There was an argument. Not loud, not chaotic, but controlled. The kind of argument that carries more danger because it is calm. Harriet's hand tightened against the back of a chair. He threatened you, Miss Marple said. Not with violence, but with exposure. With consequences. With something that would have ruined not just one life, but several. Eleanor's voice came, low and controlled. You cannot prove that. Miss Marple did not look away. I do not need to, she said. The room felt as though it had stopped breathing. In that moment, Miss Marple continued, you realized something. That he would not stop. That he would continue to control, to pressure, to destroy quietly. And so, you acted. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly, the only sign of movement she allowed. You pushed him, Miss Marple said simply. The words fell into the room like something final. No one spoke. He fell, Miss Marple went on. And in that moment, everything changed. She let the silence stretch before continuing. Because you were not alone in what happened next. Her gaze moved again, slowly, deliberately. The servants came. They saw enough. Not everything, but enough. Dr. Price was called. He understood what he was looking at. And each of you, in your own way, faced the same decision. She paused. To speak, or to remain silent. Harriet's voice trembled. And they chose silence. Yes, Miss Marple said. Eleanor's voice came again, sharper now. Because it was the right choice. Miss Marple met her gaze. Was it? The tension in the room tightened. He was destroying lives, Eleanor said, her control finally cracking just enough to reveal the truth beneath it. You do not know what he did. What he would have done. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. I know enough. Eleanor took a breath, her composure slipping for the first time. Then you know why no one stopped it. The words echoed. And in that moment, everything became clear. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I do. She looked around the room, at each face, each expression, each silent agreement. This is why the village said nothing, she continued. Not because they did not know, but because they understood. No one denied it. You did not protect a murderer, Miss Marple said quietly. You protected yourselves. Your peace. Your lives. Your relief that he was gone. The truth settled heavily over them. And that, she added, is why it was never called murder. The silence that followed was no longer controlled. It was exposed. Dr. Price finally spoke, his voice low. What happens now? Miss Marple looked at him, then at Eleanor, then at the rest. That, she said gently, depends on what you choose next. No one moved. No one spoke. Because for the first time, there was no shared answer. Miss Marple turned slowly toward the door, her task complete, the truth no longer hidden, whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. Behind her, the room remained frozen, each person left alone with their part in what had happened. And for the first time since Edwin Hawthorne's death, the silence no longer protected them. It judged them. And now you've reached the end of a mystery where the truth was never truly hidden, only ignored. If you enjoyed this story and want more dark, gripping Miss Marple-style mysteries like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a good twist they never saw coming. Because sometimes, the most dangerous crimes are not the ones we fail to solve, but the ones we choose to ignore.